Michael Shermer, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Nice to see you, and hope you're doing well. Human progress. I guess we've been challenged on that thesis for the last 6 months or so.
Well, let's hope it continues. You are obviously the editor of the Skeptic magazine, and so I want to talk to you about a number of different things, including some of the very interesting conspiracy theories that are floating around the world about COVID. And so that I don't butcher the quote, here is one that I found on NPR. With people believing that COVID-19 pandemic is part of a strategy conceived by global elites, such as Bill Gates, to roll out vaccinations with tracking chips that would later be activated by 5G technology used by cellular networks. So let's start with that. Where do these conspiracy theories come from, and what do you make of them?
Well, they come from the imaginations of people who are very conspiratorially minded. Now, in terms of response, here I invoke Hitchens' dictum, as I call it, when Christopher Hitchens said, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. That is to say, anybody can say anything. You could say the aliens planted COVID-19 in our on our planet. So what? Where's your evidence? And if you don't have any evidence, then we don't have to respond, because there's really no response to conspiracy theories that are unfalsifiable. That is, you can't refute them, you can't test it or anything like that. And there's no evidence. It's just a made up story. But things like the 5G networks, that was an interesting one that happened that way, because it was just an accidental conjunction between two completely independent things, COVID-19 and the rollout of 5G. And it's not like there's anything special about 5G other than it's more powerful and dispersal in its extent than 4G, and that's more than 3G, and so on, all the way back to flip phones. Remember the 1990s Motorola flip phones that looked like the Star Trek communicators? There were conspiracy theories around that, that, and also cancer cluster scares, that people that at this time, not everyone had a cell phone or one of these flip phones. So there seemed to be a cluster of people that had brain tumors and that used the flip phone. So there was this fear that somehow the radiation from the cell phone was causing tumors, although we showed even back then that cell phones don't give off enough energy to break the chemical bonds in cells that would cause tumors to, mutations to lead to cancerous tumors and that sort of thing. So, that's just nonsense. And 5G is just another version of that. It's not enough energy to cause something like COVID-19. In any case, COVID. That's not quite the argument, though, to be fair to them. Their argument is that 5G energy weakens the immune system, making you more susceptible to the virus that causes COVID-19, something like that. But there's still no evidence for that. And in any case, the counterfactuals refute it. That is, countries and areas that have extensive COVID-19 and no 5G. And there's places that have no 4G, 3G, they got nothing, and still they have COVID-19. So that counterfactual then refutes that particular argument. As for Bill Gates, he's been a target of conspiracy theory since the 80s, when Microsoft really was trying to take over the world of software engineering. And, but of course, the moment you have anybody that's powerful and has a lot of money, conspiracy theorists glom onto that. So, now Jeff Bezos has more money than Gates, so now he's becoming a target of conspiracy theories, particularly as Amazon is one of only 2 or 3 big influential online retailers. Of course, they're going to be targeted for conspiracy theories because that's normal. Conspiracy theories go after big governments, big corporations, big pharma, and so on. And by the way, big pharma, that's also rolled into this whole COVID-19 because of the pharmaceutical chemicals that we might take, like hydroxychloroquine, or the coming vaccine. And I know you wanted to talk about vaccines because that's going to be another huge one. We need a vaccine. The COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, is not going away. I think pretty much everybody agrees on that. We're going to we'll have it forever, and it may mutate into a more moderate virus, something like the seasonal flu. But anyway, it's not going away, so we need a vaccine. Now, so then you get to this issue of security versus freedom, and people have a peculiar idea about freedom. I should be free from having to take a vaccine or having to wear a mask or whatever. But that's not what freedom means. I mean, as you well know from having studied this, Thomas Hobbes laid out the first arguments for a social contract in which we give up certain freedoms to have safety and security. So the simplest analogy I make with wearing masks or a vaccine is you're not free to drive on the opposite side of the road, right? You give up that freedom in order to be safe from drivers hitting you. And so the freedom to swing your arm ends at my nose. You're not free to do anything you want. We give up all sorts of freedoms. So I think it's just what people get used to. And the vaccine thing is also has another element to it that it's counterintuitive, that I'm going to put a little bit of poison or toxin or germs in my body, and somehow that's going to make me more protected from the more viral form of this germ. To a lot of people, that's like, what? That just doesn't sound right. Even though it works, we have over a century of data showing that this is one of the greatest inventions of all time. I don't know. I think you might have the numbers of this. How many hundreds of millions or billions of people have been saved, or at least not suffered as much from having vaccines? And yet people still feel like you can't force me to do it. I should be free to not get vaccinated. And that, that's a tough issue.
So there are obviously limits to people's appreciation of science and understanding of science, but are you in a way pleased or encouraged by the fact that when COVID outbreak happened, people didn't start sacrificing to gods or or flagellating or something like that? People immediately turn to science and scientists, and we expect them from Europe to North America to Africa to Asia. People are looking towards scientists to come up with new ideas. We are not in some sort of a grip of a religious fervor, unless you want to talk about the political situation in the country. We'll get to that later. But are you encouraged by that? Isn't this a proof positive that humanity has now internalized a scientific view of the world? Or am I being too optimistic?
Yeah. No, I think you're realistic. I don't like the word optimism, because it implies that we're blind to the facts, and we just go around thinking your glass is half full no matter how empty it actually is. We're realists. The data shows that things are getting better, and in this particular case, we are centuries away, historically in the Western world anyway, centuries away from blaming the gods or the witches or the demons for plagues and diseases like this. But in a way, conspiracy theories are kind of like a secular religious target for explaining the origins of the virus, something like that. But I agree with you that very few people, it's a small minority of people. Unfortunately, they have their own web pages, so they get a lot of media attention. But most people want to follow the dictates of what scientists say. Even someone like Trump, who seems to often defy his scientific advisors, it's only when he thinks it's going to go against his reelection or some political reason. Otherwise, he's kind of a germaphobe, and he follows most of the dictates of science. Most politicians do in both parties, as long as the scientific finding isn't pushing one of their hot button issues. So, for example, climate change has, because of Al Gore and his film An Inconvenient Truth, climate change has kind of become associated as a left-wing liberal cause. And therefore, if I'm defining myself by my political affiliation with the right, I'm going to go against that just because that's what I'm supposed to do as a member of the team on the right. So it will appear that conservatives and Republicans are anti-science, but liberals are just as bad when it comes to hot button issues for them, like GMOs and nuclear power, they're just as irrational and science deniers as Republicans are when it comes to those particular issues, because that's a hot button issue for them. But if you take out those, then most people, most of the time, accept the science. We climb aboard airplanes without thinking twice about it and fly at 35,000 feet at 600 miles an hour. We gladly use our cell phones and our laptops and drive our cars and so on. And we accept all the science and engineering and math behind those without question. So it's really only those particular subjects.
Now, as a keen student of psychology, why do you think that people simply cannot accept that bad things just happen? I mean, we were talking about conspiracy just now.
Yeah.
Why do you think that people always see some control mechanism behind what's going on in the world, rather than just accept that in the world, which is generally getting better, some things are simply going to go wrong somewhere at some time? What do you think is going on in the human mind?
I think there's several components to that. One I call patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in random noise. We're not good at detecting randomness, right? So if you give subjects listening to, just with earphones on, listening to signals, you can give them random noises, little blips that are totally random, and they'll find a pattern. They'll hear a pattern of some kind. Same thing with dots on a screen, and you just take it up from there of any kind of patterns. We tend, the dragons in the clouds, or the face of Jesus on a tortilla, or the Virgin Mary on the side of a building. These are just random, stains and blotches that our brain sees, particularly faces. The fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobe right around here has a neural network that specializes in recognizing faces, 2 dots, a nose and a mouth, maybe some kind of oval outline, something like that. And we're really good at that, right? So there's that. Then add to patternicity, agenticity, the tendency to infuse those patterns with agency, intentional agency. There's something behind that. Now, my thought experiment on this in the believing brain was, imagine you're a hominid on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago, and you hear a rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator, or is it just the wind? So if you assume the rustle in the grass is a dangerous predator, and it turns out it's just the wind, that's a type 1 error, a false positive. You made a mistake, but it's a low-cost error to make. You just become more skittish and move away. But if you make the opposite error, if you assume the rustle in the grass is just the wind and it's a dangerous predator, you're lunch. You've just been given a Darwin Award for taking yourself out of the gene pool early. So I'm arguing that natural selection created a kind of a neural cognitive sensory apparatus system to detect patterns no matter what, just in case. But let's ask, what's the difference between the wind and a dangerous predator? The wind is an inanimate force. A dangerous predator is an intentional agent, and his intention is to eat me, and that can't be good. So we infuse these patterns with agency. So, animism and spiritism and polytheism and monotheism and, aliens and demons and witches and gods and so forth. These are all, even conspiracy theories, these are all kind of intentional agents behind the scenes, pulling the strings, making things happen. Because nothing, everything happens for a reason. Nothing happens by chance. These are very common phrases believers, almost everybody really uses, because it feels that way. And, the idea of a statistical analysis of the probabilities of randomness in the economy or in the weather or any kind of system we deal with in the modern world, that's pretty new. That's like within a century and a half at most, that we've kind of grasped that a lot of what happens in the world is random, or it's based on these kind of probabilistic things. So we get wrong so many things, all the way from the simplest things like the gambler's fallacy, where red has come up 6 times in a row, therefore black is due, or something like, or the opposite, or red has come up 6 times in a row, so I'm on a hot streak, so I should bet on red. Okay, the roulette wheel has no memory of what it just did. So each roll of the roulette wheel is independent, and therefore the odds are the same with each roll. They're not going to accumulate out, but the brain doesn't see that. The brain just sees there's some pattern here. I got 6 reds in a row, So something's going on here, right? All the way to, how we interpret the weather or the economy. We just find these meaningful patterns, and even something like insurance companies and how they evaluate risk. That's pretty new. That's like within a century or so of really fine models that accurately predict what's going to happen collectively. We evolved over millions of years without anything like that even remotely existing, right? Richard Dawkins calls this middle land, that we evolved in the middle land of the plains of Africa, where we're used to seeing things of a middling size, say from ants to mountain ranges, and they move at a middling speed, like a snail crawling, or the weather or something like this. You don't see continents drifting, you don't see 100-year patterns in the weather. You don't see light moving because it's so fast you can't detect it. That it even has a speed, or expanding universe, or quantum physics. These things are all completely counterintuitive because there's nothing in our brain to hook it onto. Like, it's like that. Really, much of physics is not like anything that you can glom onto. And the same thing with the economy. One of the difficulties of accepting, free markets and capitalism is that it just feels counterintuitive. Like, how is it I'm going to profit from you profit? How does this? I don't see that. Because in the ancestral environment of our hunter-gatherers, there was no free market. There was no invisible hand. There was no wealth that could be distributed or anything like that. Everybody was relatively poor. So the ideas behind a modern economy are counterintuitive. Which, to get to your point there, that there's very little about the modern world that we intuitively grasp. So that's why we need science. That's why we need education and literacy, and people need that information to override their instincts about the world.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere somebody writing that the complexity of the modern world has outpaced our ability to understand it with our Stone Age brains. I think that's
that's right.
So COVID is resurging throughout the world, but I think it's fair to say that the United States specifically has been really underperforming. What I want to ask you is, what do you think is behind that? Is our government particularly inept, or do you think that Americans differ from other people, maybe Canadians or Europeans, in a sense that we are more rebellious or more distrustful of our government and therefore unwilling to follow the diktats that the government throws in our way? Have you given it some thought?
Yeah, I like the interpretation by my friend and colleague, Michelle Gelfand, who is a cultural psychologist who studies tight and loose cultures. So tight cultures are cultures where most of the people, most of the time, obey the laws and rules, and they have kind of a more homogeneous perspective of their nation, their culture, and what they stand for, and they're more in unison together about that. Whereas loose cultures, so tight cultures like Germany, Japan, loose cultures like the United States, I can't think of some others at the moment, but where we're more. Huh?
Britain didn't do very well.
Yes, Britain. Yeah. Italy would be another example. There, we kind of feel like whatever the government tells me, that's sort of a suggestion. I can take it or leave it, and if I don't feel like it, I'm not gonna do it. That's kind of a loose culture thing, and Americans are more like that. So, most people seem to respect Anthony Fauci. It's like, yeah, he's a smart guy, but damn it, I'm not wearing a mask because I'm an American. Okay, what? Again, back to my, problems with understanding what freedom means. I should be free from your germs, just like you should be free from wearing a mask. So, something's got to give when the principle of harm is what matters. You're not free to harm other people, and your germs can do that. But Americans, even though they may grasp that conceptually, they feel emotionally or intuitively like I shouldn't have to do that. And so I think that's caused, because if you look at the graphs of our closing down just after Europe started to close down, like in Germany, for example, and then our rates were plunging just like they were in European countries. But then the moment that we started to reopen things where people were out and about without their masks, and I don't just mean the protests and the BLM movement or any of that, but just going to the beach, just going to bars and restaurants. There was, footage on the nightly news every night for a month of just people just not wearing their masks. And you just didn't see that in European countries where they were wearing their masks because they were told that's what you should do. And I think that's largely going to come down to a huge, colossal mistake on our part that's going to harm our economy because, we're back here in California. We're back shutting down now. You can't go into bars and restaurants are all closed except for takeout or dining out on the sidewalk or in the street. And, that's not good, but that's the result of that. So I think that's the deeper issue. I don't think it's just incompetence on the part of the government. I mean, the government, you could certainly nail Trump on a number of points that liberals have and more centrist Republicans have nailed him for. But I don't think that's the deeper problem. I think it's this cultural difference.
Yeah, I wasn't specifically thinking only of Trump. I was thinking about Trump, state governors, legislatures, basically the entire political system. When it comes to Europe, I'm wondering though if Europe wasn't already approaching a sort of level of closure and curfews that was not going to be sustainable in the long run. I'm just thinking that I'd be very surprised. I mean, I myself have been going crazy. A lot of people I've been talking to have been going crazy under the lockdown, and I also think that even with the best of intentions, at some point, the human devotion to staying in and trying to do the best will eventually evaporate, and people will do what they want to do. Which brings me to my next question, and that is that what do you think is the connection between the pandemic and the violence that we are seeing in the streets? I mean, all that pent-up energy, not to mention increased concern over our economic future, surely has a role to play in the riots, don't you think?
Yeah, maybe. I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. I'm not sure how to test it because it's a one-off event. The BLM movement, they're not going to say we're out here because we're tired of being indoors. They say we're out here for social justice because of George Floyd and so forth and the other names. And they have a point. That's right. But the critical point when it tips over from nonviolent protesting to violent protesting, riots and burning federal buildings and breaking Starbucks windows and all that craziness. This is not good for moral progress. That's the worst thing you could do. It turns people against your movement, and it rarely succeeds in getting what you want, as we know from the research on this. Nonviolent protests work far more than violent protests do. But people don't know that, or they don't care because they're not out there with a particular goal in mind as a strategy. Like Dr. King's marches and boycotts were very specifically targeted to certain cities with certain mayors or states with governors that were very racist and did it in a way to maximize the media coverage of it, all to get the laws changed. It was all orchestrated very carefully. That's not at all what we're seeing now. Now it's just a mass of people just going down there. Probably half of them, I'm guessing 90% of them, have no political ideology at all involved in it. They just want to mix things up and burn things down and just have a riotous good time and kick some ass and whatever. Or they just kind of generally anti. Oops, I lost you there. Okay, there we go. Or they're just generally anti-authority of any kind, because they're not very consistent about being, anti-authority when the violence starts and they want the police to protect them or whatever. But consistency is not, I think, part of these kinds of protests, unfortunately.
Well, that's a very good segue to the next question I wanted to ask you. So when George Floyd was killed, most of Americans, almost all Americans, saw it as an unjustifiable murder, and they want justice to be done. And that's, of course, how the riots have started. But today, the protest agenda seems to be going well beyond simple calls for justice. And it includes attacks on freedom of thought and expression, even reason and argument are being attacked as being expressions of some kind of white domination.
Right.
Of the culture. I've seen some of their tweets. So what is behind these sentiments? Where do they come from? And what do you think is going on?
Well, that I think is an extension of the postmodernism and critical theory that's been around for decades. That's come to the fore in recent years more and more, but it's been around since the 80s, really, and certainly the 90s. This idea that there's no objective truth and that everything is kind of a contest between groups for power. And it sort of starts with a Marxian interpretation where it's a class warfare, but clearly that didn't pan out. Nationalism was much stronger than socioeconomic class as a motivating factor in the First and Second World Wars, for example, and the proxy wars during the Cold War. Class had nothing to do with it. Marx was wrong about that, but the left has instead glommed onto other, so-called identity politics, other forms of identity instead of your class, your skin color and your gender and all the others. And so I think that's what we're seeing expressed now. So you see this weird, I saw this weird thing on one of the BLM web pages that they stand against the nuclear family. I'm like, what does that got to do with anything that they're, George Floyd and police brutality and, it's clear. You're right. Everybody agreed. George Floyd, that was a clear injustice. I didn't see a single conservative try to rationalize away the police violence and that. That seemed to be a universal agreement. They would have just restricted it to that and the few other names that were at the forefront there. That could have led to some real immediate police reform, because clearly that was a problem. There are some cops who should be nowhere near having a gun and a badge. They shouldn't. They are bad people. And but then the moment you start that, then you start expanding kind of a mission creep. Well, if some police are like that, maybe they're all like that. Not personally this guy, but the systemic racism in all of police. Then all of a sudden you expand to all policing is bad. Just the very idea of policing. Whoa, wait a minute. That now it goes too far, and then you lose most of your audience that would have supported you otherwise. I mean, Black Lives Matter. Yes, they do. But then you throw in this other stuff. Why the nuclear family? Because the rate of unwed births in the Black community is, I don't know, something like 75% now. And so, rather than remedying that or treating it as just a freedom issue, you're free to do whatever you want. It's like, no, having a nuclear family with a married couple, that's a white thing, and they have more power, therefore we have to be against it. And all of a sudden you've gone down some path almost nobody's going to support you on. So I think that was disappointing to me to see the BLM movement kind of move in that direction, because otherwise I would support it. If you just say, do Black Lives Matter? I go, yes, absolutely, Black Lives Matter. Or if you want to say it, Black Lives Matter too, just like other lives. Yes, absolutely. But then you throw in all this other stuff, defunding the police or all policing or even objective truth, reason, and science is a form of white suppression. It's like, you've just lost your mind if you think that. The fact that it developed in the Western world, at least along one particular pathway, that doesn't make it white or white supremacist or oppressive at all. Therefore, that's an example of it going way too far.
Well, the last point about objective truth, that's something that has been around for a while. I seem to recall around 2014 or 2015, people started talking about things like your truth, as opposed to, or truth, as opposed to real truth, and that sort of thing. And it seems to me that if there is, that there are a certain number of advances that humanity has made that should be applicable universally. Among them, of course, is freedom of speech, freedom of thought, but also reason and using reason to discover truth as an objective matter. Why are these things important? Why are these things important for human progress and in general, and COVID specifically? I know this is an easy question for you, but I still would like you to answer it, because a lot of people who might be watching this podcast may be young and don't really appreciate how progress in the world is made. How do we discover vaccines? How do we move forward? And how human progress would be compromised if we didn't rely on freedom of speech and reason and expression. So could you sort of take us home by talking about that question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the problem is, human progress comes from solving problems. That's it in a nutshell. Pretty much every step in human progress has been to solve some particular problem. And the general sort of underlying reason for that is the second law of thermodynamics, or entropy. That is, everything is running down. There are far more ways for things to go wrong than right. There's far more ways for things to be disordered than ordered. And therefore, the second law of thermodynamics is the first law of life, as I say. That is to carve out some niche of order in a chaos of entropy, and just simply clean your room every morning, because if you don't, your room will get cluttered, and wood rots and metal rusts and bodies run down and so forth. And in that sense, things like poverty, they don't need an explanation. That's what you get if you do nothing. Poverty is the normal state of things. Prosperity is the hard thing to explain, and that requires some very specific anti-entropy, or call it extropy, as the extropians call it. And so just from there, everything we do is in a way kind of pushing back against entropy and solving particular social problems or medical problems, public health problems, whatever. But that then requires understanding causality. That is, what is the cause of prosperity, or what is the cause of plagues? What is the cause of physical disability or whatever? That requires an understanding the cause of things. And that is the kind of the realm of science and reason, science and philosophy, whatever you want to describe it. That is figuring out, does X cause Y? Does A cause B? I mentioned patternicity earlier. That is, our brains have a tendency to just connect A to B no matter what David Hume called constant conjunction. A happens, then B happens. A happens, then B happens. You do that 3 or 4 times, the brain goes, okay, there's a causal connection there. A causes B, right? That's the normal way of thinking. But oftentimes they don't. They're just accidentally causally connect or just correlated but not caused. And therefore you need some mechanism to test it. How can we figure out if it's just a random pattern that my brain thinks is real or it's not real? And the answer is science. There's an experimental method, a way of testing a particular claim. Like we saw during early days of COVID, does hydroxychloroquine attenuate or even prevent COVID-19 if you get the virus, or maybe even prevents the SARS-CoV-2 virus from taking hold? Okay, nobody knew. There was a few studies that suggested this or that. Well, then we put it to the test. Within 2 months, we had an answer. It doesn't work. Okay, so that you just take that principle and just apply it to everything. What's the cause of war? What's the cause of civil wars? What's the cause of violence? Why do people commit homicides and so on? Those are the kinds of things we want to know, so that we can therefore attenuate them, or make them better for human flourishing. And so pretty much everything we all today experience that is positive for human flourishing is due to somebody figuring out the cause of the thing we don't want, or the thing we do want.
And figuring it out necessitates freedom of thought, freedom of
Oh,
expression,
yes,
being
right. That's
able
the
to.
other element. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because nobody's omniscient, right? Not even Anthony Fauci's omniscient. Everybody's wrong about a great many things. So the only way to find out is to try your ideas out in the marketplace of ideas, or just mention them to your spouse or your friend, or go to a conference and present them at a convention or conference to your peers, or publish them in a peer-reviewed journal, or publish them in a book, or go on a podcast and tell people about your ideas, and then allow questions or comments to flow after that. The reason for that is because it's if you work in isolation, it's too easy to go down a side path that turns out to lead to nothing. And it's better to catch it early before you've gone off the rails. And the only way to do that is to engage with other people. So free speech is really the foundational right of all other rights. Because the only way for me to figure out what the other rights should be is if I present them to other people that are interested in also solving problems. So like if you look at the Federalist Papers in the years leading up to the writing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, this is what they were doing. They were bouncing ideas off each other. Well, I think we should do this. No, let's not count that as a right. Let's count this as a right. And how do you know? Well, you do it by debate and disputation, argument, discussion, conversations, and so on. And nothing should be off the table. You're free to say whatever you want. And, you're going to get, of course, crazies coming out of the woodwork with that. Okay, the Alex Jones with their conspiracy theories about Sandy Hook being an inside job or whatever, 9/11. You're going to get that, but we have to allow that. And in any case, the response to bad ideas like that is better ideas. No, 9/11 was not an inside job, and here's how we know. And then he puts his evidence out, I put my evidence out, and you can decide for yourself. I even do that with the Holocaust deniers, which is a pretty odious, disgusting, really idea that's offensive to Jews, of course. But rather than just call them anti-Semites, which a lot of them are, that's irrelevant. Why are they wrong? How do you know that the Holocaust happened the way we think that it happened? Well, I wrote a book about this. So to me, the response to people like David Irving, who's a pretty strong proponent of Holocaust denial, or revisionism, as he calls it, he's wrong. And I've pointed out a great many times all the different places that he's wrong. That's the way to deal with it. And that's what we did. And, that's why he's kind of fallen out of favor, and he's largely disappeared. And that's the way to treat ideas like that.
So I really liked what you said about free speech being the foundational freedom on which others are based. And I think that's a great way to conclude our podcast. I'm deeply grateful to you for taking the time to talk to us, and stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you very much.
I will, Marion, and let me take a moment to thank you for your important work. The Human Progress site is I go to it all the time, and particularly when I need cheering up. Like, is there some good news here today? Can I find something good that happened? No, I think it's important we be data driven. Our world in data, your site, our site, skeptic.com, so on. We try to base our decisions on information, and particularly long-term trends are important.